Chapter 8 of The Web of Indian Life by Sister Nivedita, Margaret E. Noble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 Noblesse, Oblige, a Study of Indian Caste. A graver intellectual confusion than that caused by the non-translation of the word caste there has seldom been. The assumed impossibility of finding an equivalent for the idea in English has led to the belief that there is something mysterious and unprecedented in the institution. People become bewildered as to whether it is a religious or social obligation. Everyone demands of the reformer a conflict with it. The whole question grows obscure and irritating. Yet all this time we have had an exact synonym for the word, and the parallel is the closer since our word connotates the same debatable borderland between morals and good taste. Caste ought to stand translated as honor. With Oriental quaintness, it is true, India has given a certain rigidity to this idea, but her analysis of the thing itself is as profound as it is acute. Our conduct is commonly governed far more by social habit than by considerations of right and wrong. When the tide of the ethical struggle has once set in over some matter, we may regard ourselves as already half lost. Why are my friends' open letters absolutely safe in my presence, though I am longing for the information they convey? Why can money given for one purpose not be used for another, when all the canons of common sense and expediency urge that it should? Who will confess to an effort in speaking the truth at any cost whatever? Why, when I am annoyed, do I not express myself in the language of Billingsgate? To each of which questions one would reply, somewhat haughtily, that the point was one of honor, or that such happened to be the custom of one's class. Yet if we examine into the sanction which honor can invoke, there is nothing beyond a rare exercise of the power of ostracism. The Church excommunicates, the law imprisons, but society merely cuts the offender in the street. Yet which of these three inflicts the deepest wound? It is as true of London as of Benares that caste law is the last and finest that controls a man, for it comes into operation at that precise point where tribunals fail. It takes cognizance of offenses for which no judge could inflict penalties. It raises standards and demands virtues that every man will interpret according to the stringency of his pride, and yet no one can feel himself to have wholly fulfilled. And it does all this without once permitting the sensation of merit. Having done all, one remains an unprofitable servant, for no one would count the punctual discharge of debts. All debts are debts of honor. The hauteur that brooks no stain upon the name, the self-respect that builds the whole ethical code upon itself, as religious observances. These things were due, we say, to our birth or blood, or position before men. It is true that their non-fulfillment would leave a stain upon the conscience, and it is also true that the attempt to work out the obligations of honor must be the immediate test of the sincerity of one who proposes to lead a life of greater devotion and earnestness than common. Still, caste is not the same thing as personal piety, and perhaps for this reason complete renunciation of its claims and benefits is essential in India to the monastic life. There is another point about our Western conception of noblesse oblige. Few as the persons may be who could formulate their sentiment, the fact pervades the whole of the social area. Each class has its own honor. If honorable employers feel compelled to think of the comfort of their workers, honorable servants feel equally compelled to keep their lips shut on their master's affairs, and either responds to an appeal in the name of his ideal. The priest may find the honor of his profession in conflict with that of the detective, but all the world will uphold the faithfulness of both. The efficient realization of his ideals by the schoolmaster will involve an occasional pardon, even of a grave offense, if he conceives forgiveness to be the best formative influence which at the moment he can command. The very same effort in the merchant will require a distribution of punishment that is rigorous and just, since order, integrity, and unfailing promptitude, not the development of human character, are his ends. Thus every man, in every critical act of his life, calls silently for the judgment of his peers and refuses all other. The weaknesses of caste everywhere are manifold, for society, like the individual, is always apt to insist upon the tithing of mint and rue and to neglect the weightier matters of the law. But it is not usually the martyr who marks its worst failure. He is the white dove cast forth by crows, that is, a member of a higher, tried by consensus of the lower castes. We have here a case of government usurping the functions of society, much as if the headmaster should exercise authority in a dispute among boys. For it is essential to the very idea of honor that every caste should be autonomous. The true failure of caste occurs whenever it establishes such an ascendancy of social opinion over the individual's conscience that his power of advance is impeded and he becomes less of a man, or less really beneficial socially, by remaining more of a gentleman, a state of things which is not uncommon among ourselves. For we may postulate that all ideals are helpful only insofar as they subserve a man's manhood and freedom, and destructive the instant they render him less able to express his own inmost will. It is he, therefore, who ought to have been a martyr and chose ease, who is the true caste victim, not the hero of an auto da fe. That this is a real danger we all know. What Protestant has never exalted the creed of his sect over freedom of thought? What Catholic has never put comfort over spirituality? What politician has not preferred party above principle? What student of science has never been prejudiced against new truth? And if we look without, where do we not see the mere breaker of conventionality treated as an outside brotherhood? Where do we not find persons conforming to usages that displease them, merely because they would be inconvenient to dispute? A certain sweeping justification of such facts may be urged, inasmuch as there are circumstances under which the cohesion of the group is well worth the sacrifice of the liberty of a few individuals. And the habitual outrage of custom without reason is perhaps rightly held to be as antisocial as any felony. In the last resort, however, social pressure must be had in bounds, for nothing should interfere with a man's right to try himself, or sap the roots of his independence. And society is a vague and irresponsible magistrate, with so little illumination as to his own purposes and tendencies, that he frequently mistakes the pioneers of his march for deserters, and orders the stoning of prophets, whose sepulchres and monuments will be erected by his children. The question of the inner trend or intention of the social movement must form the law in whose name all doubtful cases are tried. And while it is never easy to determine the point accurately for one's own people, in the case of the Hindu race the supreme purpose of their past evolution is quite apparent. Even a cursory reading of the laws of Manu displays Indian society as united in a great cooperation for the preservation of the ancient race treasure of Sanskrit literature. The feelings must have grown up when the Vedas alone required conserving, and the families entrusted with various portions were encouraged to become in all ways dependent on the community, that every energy might be devoted to the task in hand. This is the real meaning of prostration at the feet of Brahmins, of the great merit acquired by feeding them, and of the terror of the crime of killing one. It is not the man, it is the race culture that is destroyed by such an act. As ages went on and the Upanishads and other things were added to the store, that which was hitherto memorized became entrusted to writing. The Vedas became scriptures, and now the methods of psychology, of astronomy, of mathematics, made themselves felt as integral parts of the Aryan treasure, in common with Sanskrit literature. This widened the conception of culture without liberalizing the social bearings of the question, and the Brahmin caste continued to be recognized as the natural guardians of all learning, the old religious compositions being still regarded as the type. If we ask how it happened that the Aryan folk became so early conscious of their responsibility in the matter of Sanskrit letters, there can be only one answer. They found themselves in the presence of other and unlearned races. This point brings us to the question of the origin of strongly differentiated castes in general. In its nature, caste is, as we have seen, honor, that is to say, an ideal sentiment by whose means society spontaneously protects itself from some danger against which it is otherwise defenseless. For instance, life in Texas having been for many years dependent on the possession of horses, and safeguards against the horse thief being few and difficult, he came to be the object of unprecedented social abhorrence. Horse stealing was the last crime a lost soul would stoop to. In a similar way, as some think, may have grown up the Indian feeling about cow killing. If the cattle in time of stress were killed for food, agriculture would be unable to take a new start. And so a people accustomed to eat beef grasped the situation, perhaps, and renounced the practice. But since these two sentiments pervade whole nations, they are not exactly what we are accustomed to think of as caste, inasmuch as in the latter there is a distinct gradation of rank connected with the sentiment. In the term blackleg applied by trade unionists to competing forms of labor, we have an instance of the kind we want. Here we have an occupational group giving birth immediately to the ideal which is necessary for its safety. Throughout the worlds of love, of war, and of work, indeed, honor is an instinct of the very greatest potency. How few men, after all, desert to an enemy as spies? How strong is the feeling of class obligation among servants and working men? This element is very evident in the Indian industrial castes, which are often simply hereditary trade unions. No Englishman is so powerful, nor is any Hindu so hungry, that one man could be bribed to take up the trade of another. Nothing would induce the dairyman, for instance, to take charge of a horse, or a laundryman to assist the household. But the very strongest, and perhaps also ugliest, of all possible roots of caste is the sense of race, the caste of blood. We have an instance of this in the animosity that divides white men from Negroes in the United States, and we have another instance less talked of, all up and down our vast British possessions. There is probably no other emotion so inhuman which receives such universal sympathy as this, for it is fundamentally the physical instinct of a vigorous type to protect itself from fusion, and both sides participate in the revulsion. Here we have the secret of rigid caste, for the only rigid caste is hereditary, and of hereditary caste the essential characteristic is the refusal of intermarriage. Granting, then, what could not well be denied, that the Aryan forefathers found themselves in India face to face with inferior and aboriginal races, what may we gather from the nature of the caste system today to have been the elements of the problem as they more or less clearly perceived it? Those elements we may infer to have been four in number. 1. They desired above all things to preserve the honor of their daughters from marriage with lower and savage peoples. Exclusion from marriage with any but one's own caste became the rigorous rule, and penalty fell on the father and the family that permitted a woman to go unguarded on its head. To this day, if a son marry beneath caste, he degrades himself, but if a daughter be wrongly given, the whole family becomes outcasted. 2. They seem to have desired to preserve the aboriginal races, on the one hand from extermination, and on the other from slavery of the person, two solutions which seemed later the only alternatives to Aryan persons in a similar position. Those aborigines, therefore, who became dependent on the Aryan population had their definite place assigned them in the scale of labor, and their occupations were secured to them by the contempt of the superior race. We must not forget, in the apparent harshness of this convention, its large factor of hygienic caution. The aborigines were often carrion eaters, and always uncleanly in comparison with their neighbors. It was natural enough, therefore, that there should be a refusal to drink the same water, and so on. On the other hand, it is the mistake of caste everywhere that it institutionalizes and perpetuates an inequality which might have been minimized. But we must not forget, in the case of the Indian system, the two greater evils which were avoided altogether. 3. The Aryans realized very clearly that it was not only their race, but also their civilization that must be maintained in its purity. The word Aryan implies one acquainted with the processes of agriculture, the ear to the ground, to use an Elizabethan word, accustomed therefore to a fixed and industrialized mode of living, evidently in contrast to others who are not. Fire and the processes of cooking and eating food are easily distinguished as the core of the personal life and establishment in a climate where habits can at times be made so simple as in India. It is these that can never be dispensed with, though they may be arranged for tonight in a palace and tomorrow in the jungle under a tree. In view, then, of the necessity of safeguarding the system of manners grew up the restrictions against eating with those of lower caste, or allowing them to touch the food and water of their betters. The fact that the Aryan could eat food cooked by Aryan hands alone implied that the strictest preliminaries of bathing had been complied with. By a continuous crystallization, all caste laws, from being the enunciation of broad canons of refinement as between Aryan and non-Aryan, came to be the regular caste barriers between one class and another of the same race. In this way they lost their invidious character. It is undeniable that this caste of the kitchen, so wittily named don't-touchism by a modern Hindu leader, lends itself to abuse and becomes an instrument of petty persecution more readily than the intermarriage laws. Some of the saddest instances of caste failure have occurred here. Nevertheless, the original intention remains clear and true, and is by no means completely obscured, even with the lapse of ages. It was, however, in their perception of the fourth element of the problem that the early Aryans triumphantly solved the riddle of humanity. They seem to have seen clearly that amongst the aborigines of India themselves were many degrees of social development already existent, and that these must be preserved and encouraged to progress. From such a comprehension of the situation sprang the long and still growing graduation of non-Aryan castes, some of which have established themselves in the course of ages within the Aryan pale. Marriage, for instance, is an elaborate and expensive social function in the highest classes, but as we descend it becomes easier, till amongst the Bagdas, Baras, and other aboriginal castes, almost any connection is ratified by the recognition of women and children. This is a point in which Eastern scores over Western development. For in Europe the Church has caused to be reckoned as immoral what might, with more philosophy, have been treated as the lingering customs of suborganized race strata. As is the nature of caste, mere social prestige constitutes a perpetual stimulus and invitation to rise, which means in this case to increase the number of daily baths and the cleanliness of cooking, and to restrict to purer and finer kinds the materials used for food, approximating continually toward the Brahmin standard. For is it not true that noblesse oblige? This fact it is that makes Hinduism always the vigorous living banyan, driving civilization deeper and wider as it grows, and not the fossilized antiquity superficial observers have supposed. Such then is the historic picture of the rise of caste. The society thus originated fell into four main groups. 1. Priests and learned men, the Brahmins. 2. The royal and military caste. 3. Professional men and merchants, the middle class or bourgeoisie, as we say in Europe. And 4. The working people, or Sudras, in all their divisions. Of the second group, only the Rajput branch remains now stable. For the military caste, finding itself leaderless under the Maurya dynasty, is said to have become literary, and is certainly now absorbed in the bourgeoisie. This functional grouping, however, is traversed in all directions nowadays by lines of caste. In the mountains, it is no uncommon thing to find the Brahmin acting as a laborer, impressed as a coolie, or working as a farmer, and in the cities he belongs largely to the professional ranks. Many of India's most learned and active sons, on the other hand, belong to the third and even fourth divisions, and the new castes, which are of constant growth, are less easy than the old to classify. Every new community means a new caste in India. Thus we have the Mohammedan, the Christian, and the modern reform castes, of all which one peculiarity is non-belief in the caste principle, as well as others. And who shall determine, for instance, to which of the four main grades Mohammedanism, with its inclusion of peasant, citizen, and prince, belongs? The fact is, if a man's mode of life be acceptable to his own caste fellows, the rest of Indian society has no quarrel with it. And this autonomy of castes it is which is the real essential for social flexibility and fundamental equality. As bearing on this point, few utterances have ever been so misquoted as the great dictum of Buddha that he who attains to God is the true Brahmin. For this is misquoted whenever it is made to imply that the Brahmin holds in any sense a monopoly in religion. No possible statement could be more foreign to the genius of Hinduism. When we read that shortest and greatest of India's Gospels, the Bhagavad Gita, a poem composed by Brahmins, preserved by Brahmins, and distributed through the length and breadth of the country, always by Brahmins, we find ourselves in the presence of the most comprehensive mind that ever contemplated Hindu life. The compassion of Buddha, perhaps, looms greater across the centuries, but in dealing with social problems, his very tenderness and spiritual fire made him second to Krishna, who was always calm, broad, and consistently national in his outlook. We must accept the Gita as the authoritative pronouncement on Hindu society, and the Gita rings with a constantly reiterated implication that he who attains to God is the true man, while it interprets all life and responsibility as a means to this end. Thus, better one's own duty, though imperfect, than the duty of another well discharged. Better death in one's own duty, the duty of another brings on danger. We have to remember, too, that the Gita is made up of the very best of the Vedas and Upanishads, and was specially written for the benefit of women in the working classes, who, as destitute of classical learning, had little chance of studying these great scriptures. But its contents were to depend upon Brahmin effort for promulgation. Another witness to the fact that spirituality has always been regarded in India as the common human possession lies in the Hindu word for religion itself, dharma, or the manness of man. This is very striking. The whole weight of the conception is shifted away from creed, much more from caste or race, to that which is universal and permanent in each and every human being. And last of all, we may remember that the greatest historical teachers of Hinduism, Rama, Krishna, and Buddha, besides many of the Upanishadic period, were men of the second or military caste. No, the Brahma was never, in any sense, the privileged monopolist of religion. He was a common channel of religious lore, because his actual function was Sanskrit culture, and Sanskrit happens to be the vehicle of the most perfect religious thought that the world ever produced. But realization itself has always been recognized as a very different matter from this, and Brahmin or non-Brahmin has been accepted wherever it appeared. The advantage that the priestly caste did undoubtedly enjoy, however, lay in the fact that in their case the etiquette of rank led directly to the highest inspiration, as the scholar's life, even in its routine, will be nearest to that of the saint. One peculiarity of the place of the religious life in the Indian system is that it is an inclusive term for all forms of higher individuation. Theoretically, to the Hindu mind, all genius is inspiration, the perception of unity, and the mathematics of Euclid or the sculpture of Michelangelo would be as authentic an expression of the religious consciousness as the sainthood of Francis. Only the result of this method of interpretation is that sainthood takes precedence of all others as the commonest form of greatness. Scientific research, as in the astronomy of Brahmacharya and the psychology of Patanjali, has not had sufficient opportunity of securing defined and independent scope. And literature has been yoked to the car of mythology as much as the art of medieval Italy. Nevertheless, India is too well acquainted with genius to forget that the caste of the spirit is beyond human limitation, often beyond recognition. It is held that the best lower man can do for that brotherhood which asserts itself in the consciousness of greatness is to give it freedom. Hence, a man can always be released from social obligations if he desire to live the life of ideas, of the soul. Only it is held that if he will not fulfill the law, neither shall he add to the burdens of the community. So, he who claims to be one of the great spiritual beyond castes must renounce family and property, relying upon the charity of men for his daily bread, and knowing well that for any work of scholarship such as the observatories at Benares or Jaipur, a Hindu government at least would provide him ample means. It is only as long as one avails oneself to the benefits of the social structure that it is held not unreasonable to require conformity to its usages. This renunciation is sannyas, the Indian form of monasticism, and sannyas, theories to the contrary notwithstanding, has always been open to all castes. Indeed, it is held that when the responsibilities of life are over, a man's duty is to leave the world and spend the remainder of his days in that state, and in some parts of northern India one meets with Tyagametars, or monastics, who were by birth the lowest of the low. Theoretically, the monk is caste fellow of the whole world, prepared to eat with anyone, and where, by sheer dint of spirituality and self-discipline, such a feeling is realized, every Hindu in India considers the broken bread of this lover of mankind as sacramental food. It is usual, too, to eat from the hands of holy men without inquiry as to their standing when in the world. One of the most interesting points in all this to a Western mind is the difference implied and established between the caste of priests or chaplains, on the one hand, and the fact of spiritual realization, outside all caste, on the other. Nothing in the Indian thought about life can be more striking than this. The family chaplain in Bengal may be the official teacher, but every man and woman discards his authority silently the instant they find some soul, in the world or out of it, it may be husband or child, or the holy man living in his garden, usually it is the ascetic, with a quickening spiritual touch upon their own. He or she then becomes the guru, or teacher, and this relationship is made the central fact of life. The appearance of this new teacher, when he is powerful enough to be an important social phenomenon, is the historic origin of almost all new castes. The Sikh nation was formed in this way by a succession of gurus. Chaitanya welcomed all castes to Vaishnavism and made it possible for them to rise thereby. The scavengers, too low to venture to claim either Hinduism or Mohammedanism, were raised in consideration and self-respect by Guru Nanak and Lal Begi Mehtar, the last a saint of their own degree. The preacher arises and proclaims a new idea. He gathers about him men of all classes, the educated one to the service of his thought, the ignorant swept in by the radiance of his personality. Amongst his disciples, distinctions of caste break down. The whole group is stamped with his character and prestige. Eventually, if it contain a preponderance of Brahmin elements, it may take rank with the best, carrying certain individuals up with it. But if it be composed chiefly of the scum of society, it will remain little considered, and yet, in the strength of its religious and intellectual significance, may certainly claim to have progressed beyond its original point. Such is likely to be the fate of the present Christian converts. Those who are recruited from the lowest pariahs may acquire a certain prestige from their new faith, and take a better place in the social scale consequently in centuries to come. At the same time, we must not forget that 40 or 50 years ago, conversions were made that undoubtedly involved great sacrifices, and the descendants of these Christians may lose rather than gain in the long run. Taking the history of Hinduism as a whole, we observe a great systole and diastole of caste, the Buddhist and the present Christian periods ranking as well-marked eras of fusion, while the intervening centuries are characterized by progressive definition, broken every now and then by a wave of reform which thought itself a movement towards caste abolition, but ended simply in the formation of a new group. For this is the fact in which all would-be reformations in India find at once their opportunity and their limit. It may now be taken as proved that in order to affect caste widely, the agitator would need to aim deeper than the external phenomena, at underlying spiritual impulses. If this theory of caste be valid, then we find that the word signifies not so much mere rank in society as the standard of honor which is associated with rank. And as the private's conduct may be governed as much as his officers by enlightened self-respect, we have seen that honor is something which applies to the whole of society equally. Even Tennyson, it will be remembered, pictures the country youth as out-vaunting Lady Clara Vere de Vere in her pride of birth. The word caste, therefore, is by no means that antithesis of democracy, which has been so commonly assumed. Neither, among a people familiar with the process of self-organization, would it prove any barrier to efficient cooperation. For the one essential to this power is an established habit of ignoring all points of mutual difference, not germane to the matter at hand. What we call good breeding, or what India calls caste, ought to make this easier. For any group of men met together for a common purpose find their individual rights secured to them in this way, and are free, by age-long acceptance, from any suspicion of another's desire to interfere with them. This is a basis of strength and not of weakness, so that it seems if Indian men and women are not at present capable of combined action to any great degree, it is a matter of their own neglect of the habit, and not a necessary consequence of their institutions. We need not to readily accept the statement of such weakness either as infallible. My own observation has been that the Hindu people are capable enough of vigorous cooperation along the lines natural to them, those of the undivided family, the village community, and others. That inability which Europeans would show to face these tests, they may be expected to display before ours. To be absolutely just, however, we must admit that the observance of caste law has entailed many foolish and irritating losses upon society during the last 50 years. We have seen that there are definite reasons, not wanting in cogency, why a man of good birth should not eat in all companies, or of food cooked by hands supposed less cleanly. Such rules, however, cannot be kept by those who, for any reason, cross seas to Europe. This fact, more than any other detail, makes it a matter of outcasting to take the journey, and persecutions have sometimes ensued which are shocking to contemplate. A man may care little about the loss of station for his own sake, but the shoe pinches when he finds himself unable to make worthy marriages for his daughters. Hence, he will often submit to a heavy fine in order to buy back his position. This rouses the cupidity of ignorant and conventional persons, who happen to have authority with the stay-at-home community, and such are apt to be unscrupulous in bringing about the ruin or recantation of any who resist their power. This is a series of events which does occur occasionally, but it need not be supposed that every European returning Hindu who is kept at arm's length is a martyr. There is an element of distrust for the moral results of a visit to the West in the situation, and this is not altogether unreasonable. It is chiefly with regard to possibilities of political, practical, or technical education that caste deterrence is to be regretted, and it is obvious that as communities progress in the power of estimating modern conditions, they must recognize the suicidal nature of such an attitude. Yet it is curious to note here how caste may become thus a very real instrument of equality, for the power of the individual to advance is by this means kept strictly in ratio to the thinking of the society in which he lives. This fact is characteristic. The good of caste, of race, of family stands first, and only second that of the individual man or woman in India. To take another plane, let a man of the lower castes become wealthy, and he is compelled to educate men of his own rank to marry his daughters. Thus the group to which he owes birth, vigor, and development receives from him again the benefits of his life's work. This is the exact opposite of the European device, where the upper class absorbs money, talent, and beauty from the lower, while that is continually recruited by the failures from above. The fact that every human force is polar in its moral activity needs little demonstration in the case of social pride. Every day we see this working on the one hand for the highest idealism, on the other for revolting egotism. Social exclusiveness may be condoned, it may even be robbed of its sting, but especially when coupled with personal exaltation, it can never be made anything but vulgar-looking to the disinterested outsider. It is not to be supposed that Indian caste forms any exception to this rule or double effect. Nevertheless, it is well to understand the conditions of the sentiment, perceiving how inevitably this very thing repeats itself wherever two physically distinguishable races are found side by side. And it cannot be denied that great benefits as well as great evils has accrued from caste. It is an institution that makes Hindu society the most eclectic with regard to ideas in the world. In India, all religions have taken refuge. The Farsi before the tide of Mussulman conquest, the Christians of Syria, the Jews, and they have received more than shelter. They have had the hospitality of a world that had nothing to fear from the foreigner who came in the name of freedom of conscience. Caste made this possible, for in one sense it is a social formulation of defense minus all elements of aggression. Again, surely it is something that in a country conquered for 1,000 years, the doorkeeper of the viceroy's palace would feel his race too good to share a cup of water with the ruler of all India. We do not easily measure the moral strength that is here involved, for the habit of guarding the treasure of his birth for any unborn posterity feeds a deep, undying faith in destiny in the Hindu heart. Today here, tomorrow gone, says the most ignorant sotto voce as he looks at the foreigner, and the unspoken refrain of his thought is, I and mine abide forever. Caste is race, continuity. It is the historic sense. It is the dignity of tradition and of purpose for the future. It is even more. It is the familiarity with the whole people, in all its grades, with the one supreme human motive, the notion of Noblesse Oblige. For though it is true that all men are influenced by this principle, it is also probably true that only the privileged are very conscious of the fact. Is caste then simply a burden to be thrown off lightly as a thing irksome and of little moment? And yet if India is ever to regain national efficiency, this old device of the forefathers must be modified in the process. Exactly how, the Indian people themselves can alone determine, for India today has lost national efficiency. This fact there is no gainsaying. Her needs now are not what they were yesterday. The Brahmins lose distinctiveness in these days of cheap printings and widespread literacy. But this only means that the country requires multiplied methods of self-expression as the goal and summit of her national endeavor. She wants a greater flexibility, perhaps, a readier power of self-adjustment than she has ever had. But it ought to come in an influx of consciousness of those great spiritual tides on whose surface all questions of caste and non-caste can be lifted into new and higher interrelations. Chief among all her needs is that of a passionate drawing together amongst her people themselves. The cry of home, of country, of place, is yet to be heard by the soul of every Indian man and woman in Hindustan, and following hard upon it must sound the overtones of labor and of race. Then the question of whether to walk or not in the ways of the forefathers will be lost in the knowledge of the abundant power to hew out new roads, as those fathers did before them. Has India the possibilities still left in her own nature which can bring to her such an epoch? There are some who believe that there is no task beyond the ultimate power of the Hindu peoples to perform. The nation that has stood so persistently for righteousness through untold ages has conserved such vast springs of vigor in itself as must ultimately enable her to command destiny. The far-seeing wisdom and gentleness of her old constitution may unfit her for the modern world, but they are a sure proof, nevertheless, of her possession of sufficient sense of affairs to guide her to a full development once more. For, after all, who were these old forefathers, with their marvelous cunning? What inspired them so to construct the social framework that every act of rebellion and invasion should end henceforth only in contributing a new morsel of color to fit into the old mosaic? Ah, who were they indeed? We may well ask, for have we not all this time been calling by their name one far greater than they, one infinitely more deserving of our reverence, the communal consciousness, namely, of a mighty patient people, toiling on and on through the ages up the paths of knowledge, destroying never, assimilating always, what they gain of truth and science, and hesitating only a little before fresh developments, because they are so preoccupied with the problems of the past that they do not realize that that stage is done, and that the sun is risen today on a new landscape, confronting them with fresh perils and unthought of difficulties. End of Chapter 8.